Olivia Marchant had never questioned her right to the land beneath her feet. It wasn't just acres of soil and grass stretching toward the horizon, it was the foundation of her family's legacy, a testament to generations of sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering resilience. Her great-grandfather had settled here nearly a century ago, carving a life out of the untamed landscape with nothing but calloused hands and unshakable determination. Her father had been born on this land, had worked it with the same tireless devotion, ensuring that it would remain in the family long after he was gone. Olivia had grown up knowing that one day the responsibility would fall to her, and she had never once hesitated to embrace it. This land was her blood, her history, and her future. No one could take that away from her, or so she thought. The morning it all began was like any other. The sun rose lazily over the distant hills, painting the sky in soft strokes of gold and crimson. The scent of freshly tilled earth lingered in the crisp air, mixing with the familiar, comforting aroma of hay and livestock. Olivia had been up since before dawn, as always, moving through the morning routine with the practiced ease of someone who had known no other way of life. She had checked the fences along the southern pasture, inspected the irrigation system to ensure the fields would receive the water they needed, and fed the animals, their low, contented sounds filling the silence of the vast open space. It was a life of constant labor, but she had never minded. The land gave back what she put into it, and that balance had always made sense to her. She was in the middle of repairing a section of fencing that had weakened over the winter when she first noticed them. At first, it was nothing more than a faint, mechanical hum carried on the wind, something distant enough that she might have ignored it had it not been so unusual. Frowning, she straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and turned her gaze toward the eastern boundary of her property. The sight that met her sent a pulse of unease through her chest. A line of heavy machinery stood at the far end of her land, just past the tree line where the rolling fields met the wooded outskirts. Yellow-vested workers moved methodically between them, marking off sections of land with bright orange flags and steel stakes. Further back, near the access road that led to town, a cluster of black CVs and white utility trucks were parked in neat rows, their presence stark and out of place against the rural landscape. Olivia's grip on the worn pliers tightened. This was her land. There had been no warnings, no letters, no phone calls. If a work crew had set foot here, it was because they had been sent by someone who believed they had the right to do so. But no one had that right, not without her say. Wasting no time, she climbed into her truck and drove straight toward the uninvited guests, the dusty road kicking up clouds behind her as she pressed the gas pedal harder than she should have. The closer she got, the clearer the scene became, and with each passing second, the weight of unease in her gut deepened. These weren't just surveyors or road workers. Some of the men wore suits, standing apart from the others with the air of people accustomed to being in charge. The entire setup had the distinct feel of something far too official to be a simple mistake. Slamming the truck into park, she jumped out before the engine had fully died, striding forward with a purposeful intensity that made a few heads turn before she even opened her mouth. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the open space. The nearest worker, a man in his late 50s with a clipboard and a radio clipped to his belt, glanced up and gave her an expression of practiced neutrality. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." "The hell I will." "This is my land," Olivia shot back, moving closer. "No one told me anything about this." "I don't know who you think you are, but you've got about 5 seconds to start explaining before I start making phone calls." A different man stepped forward, this time younger, dressed in an expensive gray suit that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of farmland. He adjusted the lapels of his jacket with deliberate ease before speaking. "MS Marchant, I assume." Olivia's pulse quickened at the sound of her name from a stranger's lips. "Yeah, who's asking?" "My name is Carter Mills," the man replied, his tone smooth, practiced. "I'm here on behalf of the new Property Management Authority overseeing the recent land development initiative. You should have received notice about this months ago." Her stomach twisted. Notice about what? The man's expression didn't change, but there was something behind his eyes, something calculated. "This land has been reallocated as part of an infrastructure expansion project. It's now classified under the jurisdiction of the newly annexed development zone. As such, your continued occupation of the property is in direct violation of municipal land use regulations. She stared at him, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted. Reallocated, she repeated, her voice dangerously low. This land has been in my family for generations. You can't just show up one day and decide it belongs to someone else. Carter offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I assure you everything has been done according to legal process. You should have been informed. I wasn't, she snapped. I never received a damn thing. And I don't care what some paperwork says, this land isn't yours to take. A flicker of something unreadable passed across the man's face. I understand that this is an upsetting situation, he said, his voice infuriatingly measured. But the decision is final. You'll be given a reasonable period to vacate, and there will be compensation options available. Compensation? Olivia took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You think you can pay me off? This isn't some empty plot of land. This is my home, my business, my life. Carter sighed as though he had heard the same argument a dozen times before. I'm afraid there's nothing else to discuss, Ms. Marchant. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before further legal action is taken. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but there was nothing funny about the cold certainty in his tone. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some bureaucratic error that could be corrected with a few phone calls. They were serious. They fully intended to take her land, and she would be damned if she let them. Olivia sat in her truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The echoes of Carter Mill's words still rang in her ears, each syllable sharpening the edge of her growing fury. The audacity, the absolute nerve of these people to show up unannounced, claim legal authority over land that had been in her family for generations, and then tell her she had 30 days to abandon everything she had built. It was absurd. No, worse than absurd, it was a violation, a calculated maneuver meant to strip her of everything without so much as a proper fight. They expected her to roll over, to take the scraps they threw her way and walk off into obscurity, as if she had no deeper connection to this land than a temporary tenant in a rental home. The problem was, she wasn't some passive bystander to be pushed aside. Without wasting another second, she threw the truck into gear and sped off, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind her. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could get them: City Hall. If there had been legal proceedings, if there had been documents signed, filed, and approved without her knowledge, then there would be a paper trail. And if there was a paper trail, she would find it. The drive into town was a blur, her mind a relentless loop of questions with no immediate answers. How had they done this without her knowing? What loophole had they exploited? Had there been some kind of forged signature, or had they used one of those bureaucratic tricks that allowed them to claim land without direct owner approval? It made no sense. She paid her taxes. She maintained every inch of her property. There was no reason, legal or otherwise, for her to suddenly be stripped of it. When she pulled up to City Hall, she barely waited for the engine to shut off before jumping out of the truck and storming inside. The receptionist at the front desk, a woman in her 60s with a permanently unimpressed expression, barely looked up as Olivia approached. I need to see the records for land annexation and reallocation, she said, her voice sharp and clipped. The woman, whose nameplate read Nancy Cooper, sighed as if she had been asked to lift something far heavier than a pen. Records are public, but you'll have to fill out a request form. Olivia felt a pulse of irritation but forced herself to keep calm. Fine. Give me the form. Nancy handed her a clipboard with all the urgency of someone passing a stranger a takeout menu. Olivia took it, scrawled down the necessary information in record time, and shoved it back across the desk. The woman glanced at it, then stood with a groan. Give me a few minutes. Olivia tapped her foot impatiently as she waited, her pulse hammering in her ears. The seconds stretched into minutes, and just when she was about to demand an update, Nancy returned, dropping a thick file onto the counter between them. There you go, she said, already moving to sit back down. Olivia snatched up the file and took it to the nearest empty bench. As she flipped it open, her stomach twisted. There it was, in black and white, the legal documentation of the annexation. The land had officially been transferred into the jurisdiction of the newly expanded municipal district, reclassified for urban development. The signatures were all in place, the approval stamps clean and legitimate. And yet, as she scanned the pages, something caught her eye, an unfamiliar signature listed under acknowledged landowner. Her breath hitched. The name was hers, but the signature wasn't. It was close enough that someone unfamiliar with her handwriting might not notice, but she knew without a doubt that she had never signed this document. Someone had forged her signature. Someone had taken it upon themselves to pretend she had willingly agreed to this, and the city had either failed to verify it or had simply looked the other way. A slow, simmering rage settled in her chest. She slammed the folder shut and marched back to the front desk. I need to speak with someone in zoning and land development. Now. Nancy barely looked up. They're in a meeting, then pull them out of it. The older woman let out another sigh, but when she saw the look on Olivia's face, she hesitated before picking up the phone. After a brief, hushed conversation, she put the receiver down and gestured toward the hallway. Office at the end of the hall. Don't break anything. Olivia didn't acknowledge the comment. She was already moving. The office door was marked Richard Faulkner, head of land development. Without knocking, she pushed it open and strode inside. The man behind the desk, balding and dressed in an expensive suit that contrasted sharply with the cluttered paperwork surrounding him, looked up with a mixture of irritation and mild surprise. Miss Marchant, he said slowly. To what do I owe the... Cut the crap, Olivia snapped, throwing the file down on his desk. You want to explain this to me? Because I sure as hell didn't sign it. Faulkner exhaled, lacing his fingers together as he leaned back in his chair. Ms. Marchant, I understand you're upset. No, she interrupted, her voice edged with ice. You don't understand anything? You rubber-stamped an illegal transfer of my property based on a forged signature. That's fraud. Faulkner's expression remained unreadable. The documents were reviewed and approved through the standard channels. If there was an issue, you should have raised concerns earlier. I couldn't raise concerns about something I didn't know was happening, she shot back. And now I want to know who the hell submitted this signature and who stood to benefit from making sure I never saw any of this before today. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Faulkner let out a slow breath and adjusted his tie. I'm afraid the matter has already been finalized. Your land has been reclassified, and as such, the development plans are already in motion. There's nothing I can do. Olivia felt her jaw tighten. That's bullshit. You think because the ink is dry, that's the end of it? You think I'm just going to walk away and let this happen? I think, Faulkner said carefully, that you should strongly consider the compensation package being offered. It's more than fair. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Tell me something, she said, her voice quieter now, more dangerous. How much were you paid to make this happen? Faulkner's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. That was all the confirmation she needed. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left the office, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the frame. The corridors of City Hall felt too narrow, too suffocating, as she made her way back outside, the cold air doing little to cool the fury burning beneath her skin. They thought this was over. They thought they had won. They had no idea what they had just started. Olivia didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the pile of documents spread out before her, illuminated only by the dim glow of the overhead lamp. The farmhouse, usually a place of comfort and security, felt eerily silent, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. The weight of what she had uncovered at City Hall pressed down on her like a vice. Someone had forged her signature. Someone had deliberately erased her from the records, shifting ownership of her land without her consent. And worse, everyone in the system, from the zoning office to the men in suits who had shown up with their heavy machinery, was either complicit or indifferent. No one was going to fix this for her. No one was coming to help. Her fingers tightened around the pen she had been absently tapping against the table. She needed to act, and she needed to do it now. If she wasted time, they would have their foundations poured, their permits solidified, and their hold over her land locked in beyond reversal. She wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a politician, but she was a fighter, and she wasn't about to let this happen without a damn war. At dawn, she was already in her truck, heading to the only person she could think of who might give her a straight answer. Levi Carson had been a county surveyor for over 20 years before retiring to a small house on the outskirts of town. He knew every inch of the land around here better than anyone, and if there had been foul play in the zoning process, he would have seen it. Olivia pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine and stepping out before the dust had a chance to settle. Levi was already on the porch, a cup of coffee in one hand, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His sharp eyes, still bright despite his age, narrowed slightly as she approached. "Figured you'd be by," he said before she could even speak. "Heard some rumblings. Didn't believe it until I saw them marking your land like they owned the place." Olivia climbed the steps two at a time, leaning against the railing. "They don't own it. At least they shouldn't. I need to know how they pulled this off." Levi took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke in a lazy stream. "They did it the way they always do. Quietly. Legally, but just barely. You weren't supposed to notice until it was too late to do a damn thing about it." She clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling beneath her skin. "I saw the papers, Levi. The signature wasn't mine. But they're acting like it doesn't matter, like it's already decided." "It's only decided if you let it be," Levi muttered, tossing his cigarette into the dirt and stomping it out. "But you don't have time for a drawn-out fight. They're moving fast because they don't want you digging too deep." Olivia nodded, already knowing he was right. "Then I need to slow them down." Levi gave her a long, assessing look before shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "You got your daddy's fire, that's for sure. All right, here's what you do. First, you get a cease and desist order filed. It won't stop them permanently, but it'll buy you time. Then, you find out who's really backing this project. Because I guarantee it ain't just some zoning board decision. Someone stands to make a hell of a lot of money off your land, and that's the person you need to worry about." She absorbed his words, her mind already spinning with possibilities. She needed a lawyer fast, and she needed leverage. If they had manipulated the legal system to take her land, she would use the same system against them. By midday, she was in a lawyer's office, an old brick building that smelled of leather and ink. The man across from her, Daniel Grayson, was in his 50s with a sharp, calculating expression that told her he wasn't the type to waste time. He listened as she laid out everything: the forged signature, the rushed annexation, the machinery already waiting to dig into her fields. When she was finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "You've got a case," he said finally. "A strong one. But these people aren't amateurs. They know the loopholes, and they have the resources to drag this out until you either run out of money or patience. Then we make it hurt," Olivia said flatly. "You said I have a case. So what's our move?" Grayson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We file an emergency injunction to halt construction. If we can prove fraud in the paperwork, we might be able to get the annexation overturned, but that's a longer battle. The injunction is our immediate weapon." Olivia exhaled, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. It wasn't a victory, but it was a foothold, and right now that was enough. But when she returned to her farm that evening, something was wrong. The moment she stepped out of her truck, she could feel it, a stillness that hadn't been there before. The air smelled different, a faint, acrid scent lingering on the breeze. She followed the scent toward the northern pasture, her stomach twisting with each step. Then she saw it. The barn was on fire. Flames licked hungrily at the wooden beams, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The heat was suffocating, pressing against her skin even from a distance. She ran forward, her heart pounding, but she already knew there was nothing she could do. The structure was too far gone, the fire too fierce. By the time the fire department arrived, it was over. Charred beams stood like skeletal remains against the smoldering wreckage. Olivia stood in the ashes, fists clenched at her sides, her throat tight with fury. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. And she had just run out of patience. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey untouched beside her, staring at the legal documents spread across the worn wood. She had played by the rules today, gone through the proper channels, but these people weren't interested in rules. They weren't afraid of the law. It was time to stop thinking like a landowner and start thinking like a soldier. She made a list. People she needed to talk to, moves she needed to make. By morning she had a plan. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. And they wouldn't see her coming. The smell of smoke still clung to Olivia's clothes as she stood on the scorched earth where her barn had once been. The fire was out, but the damage was permanent. Everything inside equipment, feed, records was gone. It was a calculated move, an attack meant to send a message, and the people behind it wanted her to know exactly what kind of power they had. But she wasn't scared. No, fear wasn't the right word for what churned inside her. This was something colder, something more controlled. Fear was paralyzing. This was fuel. She had spent the night making calls. The fire chief had been useless, muttering something about old wiring and spontaneous combustion, despite the fact that she had rewired that barn less than a year ago. The sheriff hadn't been much better, treating her concerns like a nuisance rather than a crime. There were no witnesses, no obvious evidence of arson, and no suspects. Just another unfortunate accident on an old farm. That was their story, and they weren't interested in hearing anything that contradicted it. But Olivia had lived in this town long enough to know the truth. If no one was willing to investigate, it was because they had already been told not to. She stood there long after the sun had risen, watching the charred beams cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. A few of her ranch hands had come by at dawn, offering condolences, asking if she needed anything. She had thanked them, assured them that everything was under control. But the truth was, nothing was under control. Not yet. By mid-morning she was back in town, stepping into Daniel Grayson's office. The lawyer looked up from his desk, taking in her smoke-streaked clothes and the hard set of her jaw. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. He simply gestured for her to sit. "They're pushing," Olivia said without preamble, dropping into the chair across from him. "Hard. They burned down my barn last night." Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Do you have proof?" Olivia shook her head. "Nothing that'll hold up in court. But we both know what this is." He nodded slowly, tapping a pen against the desk. "Then we need to push back harder." "I'm done waiting," Olivia said. "What's our next move?" Grayson leaned forward, his expression serious. "The injunction we filed yesterday went through. Legally, they have to halt all construction and development on your land until this gets sorted. But I guarantee they'll try to ignore it. They'll keep moving, keep working. Hoping you don't have the resources to fight it. That's what these companies do. They bury you in legal fees until you either give up or go broke." Olivia clenched her jaw. "Then we make it as expensive for them as possible." Grayson's mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I like the way you think." He rifled through a stack of papers, pulling out a document and sliding it across the desk. "I had a feeling you wouldn't back down, so I started digging. The company leading the development, Creston Holdings, is just a front. The real money is coming from a private investment firm based out of Dallas, and one of their major investors." He tapped the page. "Senator Robert Langford." Olivia narrowed her eyes. She knew that name. Everyone did. Langford was a power player, a man who had built his career on quiet backroom deals and an uncanny ability to make problems disappear. If he had a stake in this, it meant the fight was bigger than she had realized. "So, what's the play?" she asked. Grayson leaned back. "Langford operates in the shadows. He doesn't like publicity, doesn't like his name attached to controversy. If we can prove his involvement, if we can drag this fight into the public eye, he'll pull his money out before it taints him. Without his funding, Creston Holdings loses its teeth." Olivia nodded slowly, turning the information over in her mind. "And how do we get that proof?" Grayson sighed. "That's the tricky part. We need a paper trail. Bank records, emails, anything that ties him directly to the deal." Olivia exhaled sharply. "And where do we find that?" Grayson hesitated, then said, "Creston Holdings has an office in town. Small, mostly just a front for their field operations, but their records have to be stored somewhere. Olivia didn't need him to spell it out. If they wanted proof, they'd have to go looking for it themselves. That night, Olivia parked 2 blocks away from the Creston Holdings office, her truck hidden in the shadows of a closed auto repair shop. The streets were quiet, the town settled into its usual nighttime lull. She wasn't stupid enough to break in, she wasn't about to hand them an easy way to paint her as a criminal. But she needed to see how they operated, needed to get a sense of what kind of security they had, how careful they were with their information. She sat in the truck, watching the building. No security cameras that she could see, no late-night employees, just a locked door and a dark office. But as she sat there, something shifted. A sleek black sedan pulled up outside, its tinted windows reflecting the dim streetlights. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, glancing around before making his way to the entrance. He punched in a code at the keypad, and the door clicked open. Olivia leaned forward, heart pounding. The man disappeared inside, and for several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, the lights inside flickered on, and a second later, the glow of a computer screen illuminated the front window. She pulled out her phone, snapping a few pictures. Whatever was happening in there wasn't routine, and if this man was working late, it meant there was something worth hiding. The door opened again, and the man stepped out, locking up behind him before sliding back into his car. Olivia watched as he drove off, her mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, she sent the pictures to Grayson. He called her 5 minutes later. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, his voice tight. "No." "His name is Jonathan Reyes. He's one of Langford's personal attorneys." Olivia's pulse quickened. Why the hell is Langford's lawyer sneaking into Creston Holdings' office in the middle of the night? That, Grayson said, is exactly what we need to find out. The fight had just taken a turn, and Olivia was more than ready. Olivia knew the fight had shifted. The moment she heard Jonathan Reyes' name, the landscape of the battle transformed from a local land dispute into something much larger, something deeper and far more dangerous. Senator Langford's involvement had always been a quiet suspicion, a shadow lurking behind paperwork and legal loopholes, but now she had a direct connection, a man who didn't operate in the public eye, unless absolutely necessary. If Langford had sent his lawyer down here in the dead of night, it meant there was something inside that office worth protecting. It meant she was closer than she had realized. She spent the next day pretending to run normal errands, making sure to be seen in town, at the feed store, at the gas station, chatting with familiar faces just long enough to ensure she wouldn't be remembered for acting strange. She knew how people in small towns operated. Word spread fast, and the last thing she needed was anyone asking why she was poking around Creston Holdings. By the time evening rolled around, she was back in her truck, parked in the same shadowed spot as the night before. She had no intention of breaking in, but she wanted to see if Reyes or anyone else would return. Hours passed. Nothing. The building remained dark, the parking lot empty. She was about to leave when something caught her eye, a faint glow from the alley behind the office, the flickering orange light of a cigarette ember. Someone was back there, hidden just out of sight. Olivia narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. She shut off the engine and slid out of the truck, moving silently, keeping to the edges of the buildings as she approached. The man was leaning against the back entrance of Creston Holdings, his phone in one hand, his cigarette in the other. He wasn't dressed like a lawyer or a businessman. Work boots, jeans, a thick jacket to keep out the evening chill. Olivia stayed in the shadows, listening. "Yeah, she's still poking around," the man muttered into his phone. "No, I don't think she's going to back off. We might need to handle it sooner than planned." A pause. "Yeah, I get it, but if she doesn't take the buyout, we're looking at a much bigger problem." Another pause. Yeah, I'll take care of it." Olivia felt the slow burn of rage settle in her stomach. Take care of it. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. They weren't just hoping she would walk away, they were planning for when she didn't. She stepped back carefully, keeping her breath steady, her movements controlled. The last thing she needed was to startle the man and end up face to face with someone whose orders likely didn't involve playing nice. She made it back to her truck without a sound, her pulse hammering in her ears. As soon as she was far enough away, she called Grayson. "We have a problem," she said the moment he picked up. "I just overheard one of their guys talking about handling me. This isn't just about legal pressure anymore." Grayson swore under his breath. "Are you sure? Positive? They're getting impatient." There was a long silence on the other end. "Then I'll file for additional protective measures in the injunction, but that won't stop them if they're moving outside the legal system. You need to be careful, Olivia." She gritted her teeth. "I'm done being careful." The next day, she went straight to the sheriff's office. She knew it was probably useless, but she had to at least make them aware that she wasn't going to be intimidated into silence. She pushed through the door, her boots heavy against the old wooden floors, and locked eyes with Sheriff Calloway, a man who had been in office longer than anyone could remember and had built a career on knowing when to look the other way. "I need to file a report," she said, her voice firm. Calloway sighed, setting his coffee down. "What's the complaint?" "Threats. Vandalism. Arson, if you actually want to do your damn job." The sheriff gave her a slow, measured look. "You got proof of any of that?" Olivia leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. "I have a burned-down barn, a man I overheard talking about handling me, and a land dispute that smells like corruption from a mile away. You really want to pretend you don't see what's happening here?" Calloway exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. "Look, Olivia, I understand you're upset. Don't patronize me." His expression hardened. "But you don't have anything solid. You don't have names, you don't have recordings, and you sure as hell don't have any evidence tying these people to a crime. You want me to open an investigation on nothing? You know how that makes me look." "I don't give a damn how it makes you look," Olivia snapped. "I care about the fact that these people are trying to push me off my land, and they're willing to do a lot worse than forge a few documents to make that happen. So either you do something now, or the next time I come in here, it's going to be because someone got hurt." Calloway stared at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. "I'll see what I can do." It was a half-assed promise, but she would take it. For now. But she wasn't relying on the law to protect her. That night, she reinforced the locks on every door and window in her house. She checked the cameras she had installed months ago, making sure they were working properly. She loaded her shotgun, setting it beside the door. She didn't want to fight, but if they brought one to her doorstep, she'd be ready. Then, just past midnight, the power went out. Olivia was on her feet in an instant, moving through the dark with practiced efficiency. She had grown up in this house, knew every creaky floorboard, every shadow. She reached for her flashlight, flipping the switch. Nothing. The batteries had been fresh that morning. A low hum of unease settled in her gut. She moved toward the front window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered outside. The moon cast long, silver streaks across the fields, illuminating the empty gravel road leading up to her house. And then she saw them. 3 figures, moving along the fence line, just barely visible against the darkness. They weren't carrying flashlights, weren't making a sound. They weren't here for a friendly conversation. Olivia stepped back, her pulse steady, her hands tightening into fists. They thought they could scare her. They thought she would run. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Olivia didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't let panic take root as she watched the dark figures advance along the fence line. Every muscle in her body was coiled, her mind sharp, calculating, already running through possibilities. This wasn't an empty threat anymore, this was real. They had cut the power, disabled her flashlight, and now they were moving in the shadows, methodical, controlled like men who had done this before. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were here to end this. She reached for the shotgun by the door, her fingers wrapping around the smooth, familiar grip, but she didn't raise it yet. She needed to know what she was dealing with. If they had guns, if they had come expecting resistance, if they were prepared to bury this problem tonight, then she had to be smarter, faster. She moved toward the back door, her boots silent against the wooden floor, pressing herself against the wall before easing a glance out the rear window. Another figure was near the barn, partially obscured by the skeletal remains of the burned-out structure, watching the house like he was waiting for a signal. They were surrounding her. Good. That meant they weren't expecting her to come to them. Without a sound, Olivia unlocked the back door and slipped out, the night air cool against her skin, the scent of smoke still lingering from the fire that had stolen part of her land. The world was silent except for the faint rustling of wind through the dry grass, the distant call of an owl perched somewhere in the darkness. She kept low, moving along the side of the house, sticking to the deep shadows where the moon couldn't touch her. The man by the barn hadn't noticed her yet. He was too focused on the house, waiting, expecting movement from the inside. She crept closer, gripping the shotgun tighter, her heart a steady, controlled rhythm in her chest. When she was close enough to see the outline of his jaw, the curve of his wrist as he shifted his stance, she finally spoke. "You're on private property." The man spun, his hand darting toward his waist, but Olivia was faster. She raised the shotgun, not aiming to kill, just to make a point, and fired into the dirt near his feet. The sound shattered the quiet, rolling across the open land like a crack of thunder. The man stumbled back, cursing, hands up in surrender, but Olivia wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the others. The figures near the fence froze, momentarily unsure, thrown off by the sudden explosion of noise. That hesitation was all she needed. She fired again, this time toward the fence line, deliberately off target but close enough that they knew she wasn't bluffing. "Run," she ordered, her voice sharp, unwavering. For a second, they didn't move. Then one of them cursed under his breath, turned, and took off into the night. The others followed, their footsteps fading as they disappeared into the tall grass, swallowed by the darkness. Olivia kept her gun raised, her stance steady, waiting, until she was certain they were gone. Then, and only then, did she lower the barrel. The man by the barn was still there, breathing hard, his hands half raised like he wasn't sure whether to drop them or keep playing it safe. Olivia stepped closer, the shotgun still in her grip, but now resting casually against her shoulder, her expression cold, unreadable. "Who sent you?" she asked. The man hesitated. Olivia tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "I won't ask again." He swallowed, glancing toward the road where his associates had vanished. When he spoke, his voice was rough, reluctant. "It's bigger than you think." Olivia's jaw tightened. "Try me." The man exhaled sharply, then finally muttered, "Langford's pulling out. He doesn't want the heat. But Creston Holdings, they're not done. They've got too much money in this, too many promises made. They needed you gone yesterday, and now they're running out of patience." Olivia let the words sink in. Langford was out. That was something. But if Creston Holdings was still in the game, still determined to take her land by any means necessary, then this wasn't over. Not yet. She took a step back, motioning toward the road with the barrel of the shotgun. "Get out of here, and tell your bosses if they send anyone else, they won't be walking away next time." The man hesitated for only a second before he turned and ran. Olivia watched him go, waiting until the darkness swallowed him whole, until the night was still again. Then, finally, she exhaled, rolling the tension from her shoulders. She had won this battle. But the war wasn't finished. The morning after the standoff, Olivia sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, staring out over the land she had nearly lost. The silence felt different now, not like the eerie stillness of something watching from the dark, but the heavy, expectant quiet that followed a battle not yet finished. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke from the burned barn, but now it was mixed with the damp freshness of morning dew settling over the fields. The pastures stretched out before her, untouched, undisturbed, as if they hadn't been at the center of a war just hours before. She had spent the night reinforcing everything securing the house, checking the property line, making sure there were no more unwelcome visitors lurking in the shadows. The men had run, and she doubted they would return any time soon, not after the message she had sent. But she knew this wasn't over. They would regroup, rethink their strategy. Creston Holdings wasn't the kind of company to simply accept defeat. They had invested too much, built too many connections, and played too many hands to just walk away because of a few shotgun blasts in the night. No, they would come back. They would find another way, and Olivia would be ready. By noon, she was sitting in Daniel Grayson's office again, her boots propped up on the chair beside her, arms crossed as he read through the latest legal updates on the case. His expression was unreadable, but she had come to recognize the slight tension in his jaw when he was thinking, the way his fingers tapped against the edge of the desk when he was trying to find the right way to deliver bad news. Langford's officially pulled his funding, he said finally, setting the papers down. That's the good news. Without his backing, Creston Holdings is losing its biggest political shield. That means their legal defenses are weaker, their influence in the courts diminished. Olivia took a sip of her coffee, waiting. And the bad news. Grayson sighed. They're still pushing forward. They're restructuring, shifting assets, trying to find new investors to keep the project afloat. They might have lost Langford, but they're not backing down. Olivia exhaled through her nose, nodding slowly. She had expected as much. So, what do we do next? Grayson leaned back in his chair, studying her. Legally, we keep pressing. The injunction is holding for now, and we're building a stronger fraud case with the forged signature. But Creston isn't just relying on legal loopholes. They're using pressure tactics, intimidation. If they can't win this in court, they'll try to make your life miserable until you give up. Olivia smirked, shaking her head. They think I scare that easy. Grayson chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. No, and that's exactly what worries them. For the next week, she prepared for whatever move they would make next. She reinforced her fences, installed more cameras, made sure that every inch of her land was protected. She met with local ranchers, talked to neighbors, quietly spreading the word about what was happening. The more people who knew, the harder it would be for Creston to move in the dark. And then, just when things seemed to settle, the next blow came. She was in town picking up supplies when her phone buzzed with an alert from her security system. At first, she thought it might just be another coyote wandering too close to the fence line. But when she opened the app and saw the live feed, her blood ran cold. A team of men in construction gear was on her land, moving quickly, systematically, tearing up the dirt with heavy machinery. Trucks were parked along the eastern property line, the same orange stakes marking off sections like she had seen before. This wasn't just another scouting mission. This was them breaking ground. She was already moving before she realized it, shoving open the door of her truck and peeling out of the parking lot, tires kicking up gravel as she sped back toward the farm. Her heart pounded in time with the roar of her engine, fury building with every mile that passed. They were violating the injunction. They were doing this in broad daylight, counting on the fact that she wouldn't be able to stop them fast enough. But they had underestimated her. She skidded to a stop at the edge of the field, jumping out before the truck had fully settled. The workers barely had time to react before she was on them, marching straight toward the nearest foreman, her presence like a storm rolling in. "You have 10 seconds to shut this down," she growled, her voice steady, lethal. The man, a middle-aged worker with a clipboard, barely had time to stammer out a response before she was shoving the court order into his chest. "This is illegal. You're trespassing, violating an active injunction. If you don't get your men and your equipment off my land right now, I will have every single one of you arrested by the end of the day." The man paled, eyes darting toward the other workers, unsure of what to do. I was just told to. "I don't care what you were told," Olivia snapped. "Who sent you?" The foreman hesitated, then finally muttered, "Creston Holdings." They said the permits were clear, that the injunction had been lifted. Olivia let out a sharp breath through her nose. Of course they had. They were trying to bluff their way into forcing progress, counting on her to be too slow to react. But they had miscalculated. "You have 5 seconds," she warned. The foreman hesitated a moment longer, then finally waved a hand. "Shut it down. Everyone, pack it up." The workers didn't question him. One by one, they powered down their machines, loaded their gear back into the trucks. Olivia stood there, arms crossed, watching them retreat like a pack of scavengers that had been caught somewhere they didn't belong. It wasn't a full victory, not yet. But it was a battle won. By the time the dust had settled, Olivia was already on the phone with Grayson. "They just tried to start construction," she said the moment he picked up. They claimed the injunction was lifted. Grayson swore under his breath. They're testing boundaries, seeing what they can get away with. We'll hit them hard with this. File a motion for contempt of court. They can't keep pulling stunts like this without consequences. Olivia nodded to herself. Good. Let's make sure they feel those consequences. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal action. Grayson moved fast, filing motions, pulling in contacts, making sure the courts were aware of Creston's blatant disregard for the law. The company was fined heavily for violating the injunction, and with Langford out of the picture, their financial stability started to crumble. Investors backed out, contractors refused to work under uncertain legal conditions. And then, finally, after months of fighting, after sleepless nights in burned barns and threats whispered in the dark, the final blow came. Creston Holdings officially pulled out of the project. The land was returned to Olivia, the fraudulent annexation overturned, the permits revoked. She had won. But she knew better than to think it was over. There would always be another company, another politician, another scheme designed to strip landowners of what was rightfully theirs. But now they knew what she was capable of. They knew she wouldn't back down, wouldn't be intimidated. She had set a precedent, made an example out of the people who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. And now, when she stood on her porch, looking out at the land her father had fought to keep, she knew that as long as she was breathing, no one would ever take it from her again.